I have been an assessor with the Dockyards Authority for 19 years, and in that time I have logged approximately 11,000 impound arrivals at Port Orvithkal. Derelicts, repossessions, seized contraband carriers, ships that lost their crews to the drift, and came in on automated recovery beacons, with no one aboard to explain what had happened. In 19 years, I have seen most things that a deep fringe impound station has to offer. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say that. I don't mean I have seen everything. I believed that nothing arriving at Dock 9 Tertiary would require me to update my understanding of how the galaxy works. I was wrong, and the correction arrived on a Tuesday, in the shape of a Class 23 survey cruiser and a human woman who asked me where the coffee dispenser was. My name is Tevith Sewer. I am Orvathi, which is to say I am a species not particularly suited to violence, confrontation, mortal danger of any kind. We are archivists by evolutionary temperament. We build good filing systems. We notice details. We do not, as a general rule, board derelict ships alone in the dark, and we consider this a sound policy. Orvithkal sits at the edge of the Vethran expanse, 3 transit hours past the last major shipping lane, and roughly 2 beyond anything a reasonable species would call civilization. It exists because ships still move through the expanse, survey vessels, independent haulers, occasionally the odd military resupply run, and ships that break down in the expanse have to go somewhere when the recovery drones bring them in. We are that somewhere. It is not glamorous work. The pay is adequate. The paperwork is relentless. And I have learned to find a kind of peace in its relentlessness, the way some beings find peace in counting sand. The survey cruiser came in on a Wednesday, under tow from an automated recovery drone that had found it drifting at the edge of the Hareth corridor, about 800,000 kilometers from the nearest nav buoy, which is to say nowhere in particular. The ship was a Valdrath-class deep survey hull, registry number VD4471 Call, previously under contract to a hegemony survey consortium that had filed a notice of loss 14 months earlier when the crew stopped transmitting. The consortium had already paid out the insurance claim, which meant the ship now technically belonged to the underwriting authority, which had, in turn, transferred the impound lien to us. Because no one at the underwriting authority wanted to pay the cost of transporting a derelict hull from the Vethran expanse back to the core. This is how things end up at Port Orvithkal. Nobody wants the bill. Process the arrival paperwork myself. VD4471 Call came through the outer bay doors at 0340 local time, dropped by the recovery drone at the tertiary dock, and locked into berth 9T on mag clamps at 0347. The dock sensors did a standard sweep. Hull integrity at 61%. Power plant in emergency conservation mode. Life support nominal but reduced. Atmospheric mix inside the hull, slightly off standard but breathable. Internal temperature was cold, approximately 4 degrees Celsius across most of the ship, according to the sensors, rising to roughly 9 degrees in the engineering section, where the plant was still generating residual heat. No life signs registered aboard. This is standard for a derelict that has been adrift for 14 months. The registry notation in the consortium's loss report listed the original survey crew as 7 beings. Species breakdown: 2 Orvathi academics, 2 Hareth technicians, 1 Valdrath engineer, and 2 humans, both listed as contracted environmental specialists. No explanation of what had happened to them. The consortium's report simply said, crew unaccounted for, contact lost, ship abandoned or lost under unknown circumstances. I flagged the human listing because it is standard practice with Deathworlders to note their involvement in any incident report, even a historical one, not for any alarming reason, simply because the authority's insurance riders require it. Humans have a habit of making situations more complicated than expected, and the adjusters like to know about it in advance. I was not expecting this notation to become immediately relevant. At SU615, I received a standard boarding authorization request filed by a contracted recovery specialist named Karis Vale, human, female, certified under the Hegemony Independent Recovery and Salvage Act, subclassification hazard grade 3. Her paperwork was immaculate. I want to say that clearly, because it matters. She had filed the authorization request before the ship finished docking. which means she had been tracking VD42471 Call's approach on public beacon data and had the forms drafted and waiting. The request included a hazard grade acknowledgement, a proof of one from a hegemony registered surety, and a 2-page technical brief on the Valdrath-class survey hull, atmospheric systems, power plant layout, known structural failure points. That read as though she had written it herself, from direct experience, rather than pulled it from a registry library. I approved the authorization. She was in the system. Her credentials checked clean. There was nothing in the intake procedure that told me to do otherwise. And if I am honest, a human being in a hazard-rated recovery suit asking to board a cold, dark, slightly broken derelict in an impound dock did not seem at that moment like a situation requiring my personal concern. She was a professional. The ship was locked on mag clamps. I had 6 other arrivals to process before the end of my shift. I approved the authorization at 0621 and went back to my terminal. Karis Vale arrived at the dock at EO714. I saw her on the bay cameras. She was shorter than I expected. They often are, the ones who do this work. Short and compact. The way species tend to get when their evolutionary history involves squeezing through things that want to kill them. She was wearing a recovery suit that had clearly seen in use. Patched on the left shoulder, a different grade sealant strip across the right forearm, a scuff across the helmet visor that had been polished but not removed. She carried a toolkit bag over one shoulder and a compact survey scanner in left hand. She had no visible weapons, which I noticed and mentally noted and then unnoted. Contracted recovery specialists are not required to carry visible weapons, and the absence of them does not mean anything in particular. She checked in at the dock access console, confirmed her authorization, looked at the ship for a moment, just looked at it, the way you look at a thing you are trying to read, and then walked up the boarding ramp without drama. I logged the entry timestamp at 7:17 and returned to my other work. The Kethforth arrived at 0849. I want to explain what the Kethforth are, for the record, because this document may eventually be read by someone who has not had the particular experience of meeting them professionally. Kethforth are a mercenary caste species, native to the outer Hareth belt, yellow-eyed, heavily built, averaging about 2 meters tall, with a secondary set of limbs that are technically arms but function more like reinforced tools in a fight. They operate in clan groups that they call crews, and their primary economic activity, loosely described, is taking things that belong to other people and arguing legally, or otherwise, about who the things belong to afterward. This particular crew was 4, a crew leader who identified himself as Orith Vel, and 3 subordinates whose names I did not catch and whose faces, frankly, I have not retained with great clarity. They were large. Their equipment was expensive in the way that things are expensive when someone is paid for them. Orith Vel had a lean document, actual printed hard copy, which nobody does anymore, which I have since come to understand is a deliberate tactic, because hard copy is harder to query in real time than a digital filing. Claiming a prior maintenance debt against VD4471 call on behalf of a service company that I could not immediately locate in the registry. The lien was almost certainly fabricated. I want to note that, not certainly, there are legitimate cases where maintenance debts end up attached to derelicts in ways that are difficult to trace through impound records. But the lien that Orith Vel placed on my counter that morning had the texture of documentation assembled in a hurry by someone who knew what the pieces were supposed to look like, but had not worried too hard about whether they would survive detailed examination. I logged it. I told him I would need to verify the filing with the main registry, which would take standard processing time, which in the expanse means at minimum 48 hours. He told me that 48 hours was unacceptable. He told me that the lien gave his crew the right to access the ship immediately to secure their client's assets pending resolution. He told me this in the particular tone of a being who is accustomed to being large enough that people do not argue with him. I told him that a boarding authorization had already been approved for a contracted recovery specialist, and that I could not grant a second access authorization for the same vessel until the first party had completed their assessment or vacated the berth. Vel looked at me for a moment with those yellow eyes and then said that was easily resolved. He and his crew walked toward Dock 9 Tertiary. I want to say for the record that I sent a security notification at 0853. Port Orvithkal has a security staff of 6. 2 were on shift at that time. Standard response for a Dock 9 notification is approximately 12 minutes. I logged the notification, I noted the time, and then I pulled up the dock sensor feeds, because what I was going to do for the next 12 minutes was watch. I have been an assessor here for 19 years. In my experience, when 4 large Keth Vorath with expensive equipment walk onto a dock toward a derelict ship, what happens next tends not to be complicated. The person already on the ship comes off the ship. There is an unpleasant conversation. Security arrives, takes statements, and the matter proceeds through formal dispute channels. Nobody gets hurt, because the person already on the ship is rational and understands the geometry of the situation. This is what I expected to happen. At 8:56, Orith Vel and his 3 crew members boarded VD-4471 Kal via the same boarding ramp Karis Vale had used 99 minutes earlier. At 0856 and 40 seconds, nothing had changed. The dock sensors showed the ship exterior undisturbed. The boarding ramp was retracted. Bay doors closed. Everything normal. At 0858, one of the subordinate Keth Vorath, the one who had been walking third in the boarding order, which I know because I had the entrance feed queued, exited the ship at a pace that I am going to describe as rapid, not the pace of someone who had completed a task. The pace of someone who had received new information about a situation and was processing it, physically. He came down the boarding ramp in 6 strides, reached the dock floor, and then stood there for approximately 4 seconds in the posture that Keth Vorath adopt, bond, when their secondary limbs have retracted fully into their so-guard position, which is not something they do voluntarily. It happens under threat stimulus. Their bodies do it faster than they can decide to. He stood on the dock floor with his secondary limbs retracted, and his primary hands out, open and empty, and he stared at the boarding ramp. He did not move for 40 seconds. Then he moved away from the ship toward the far end of the dock, where the maintenance equipment was racked, and he sat down on a coolant line housing and did not look at the ship again. I pulled up the dock audio feed. The dock audio on Tertiary is not high fidelity. It is designed to catch hazard alarms and raised voices at the access console, not to record private conversations between beings sitting on coolant housings 40 meters away. What I could hear was ambient, the low-frequency hum of the mag clamp generators holding VD-4471 Kal in its berth, the ventilation cycling in the bay ceiling, faint atmospheric seal that runs along the outer door seams. And underneath all of that, from inside the ship, something that the audio log records as mechanical, indeterminate source, low frequency, likely structural. The log software flags it as non-hazard. Listened to that audio segment several times since. The mechanical low-frequency sound is consistent with pressure doors cycling, which I have mentioned. But there is another component that the software labels indeterminate, and which I have not been able to conclusively identify. It is present in the audio from 0858. From the moment the first subordinate exited, 0916 when Karis Vale walked off. It is a low, continuous tone, not constant but patterned, with intervals that a more technically minded analyst than I am might be able to decode. I have submitted it to the authority's Technical Analysis Archive for review. As of the date of this report, no finding has been returned. At 0901, the second subordinate exited. Faster. Not running. I want to be technically accurate, but the kind of movement that would become running if the being doing it allowed themselves to commit to it. He came down the ramp in 4 strides, hit the dock floor, and walked to the far wall at a pace that had nothing casual about it. He passed the first Keth Vorath without speaking, went to the very end of the dock, put his back against the hull plating, and stayed there. I was watching the feed with my full attention now. The second subordinate against the wall was doing something with his primary hands that I initially read as checking his equipment. Then I realized he was not checking anything. His hands were moving in the small repetitive pattern that Keth Vorath make when their nervous system, using a stimulus it cannot categorize. It is not a voluntary gesture. It is the Keth Vorath equivalent of what other species do with their breathing when they are trying to stabilize themselves after fright. Regulatory behavior. Automatic. Below conscious control. He was doing it without appearing to notice he was doing it, staring at the space between himself and the ship, and his hands kept moving. At row 903, the third subordinate exited. He was moving quickly enough that I want to call it a controlled exit, and leave it at that. He did not go to the far wall. He went straight to the dock access hatch, put his hand on the release, and then did not open it. He stood with his hand on the release, facing away from the ship, breathing in the particular way that large beings breathe when they are recalibrating. I want to note what the dock sensors registers in the 5 minutes between 0858 and 0903, because it is relevant to what the three of them looked like when they came out. The atmospheric sensors in the dock bay, not inside the ship, in the dock bay proper, registered a trace variation in the air composition at the base of the boarding ramp, a slight reduction in oxygen concentration, within normal variance for a facility like Port Orvith Call, easily explainable by a dozen routine factors. I would not have noticed it if I had not been looking for it, and I only went back to look for it 3 days later, when I had read the Valdrath-class technical manual in full and understood what the environmental response system could do. The trace variation was at the threshold, not enough to affect a being in the open dock bay, not enough to affect anything at all, except as an indicator that somewhere inside the ship, the atmospheric composition in certain compartments was not what it had been at 0856. At 0904, no one else had come out. 0905, no one else had come out. The dock was very quiet. The three subordinates were distributed around the bay like 3 points of a triangle, with the ship at the center, and none of them were moving toward each other or toward the hatch, and the only sounds were the mag clamp hum and the ventilation and the indeterminate low-frequency tone on the audio feed that the software had, logged as non-hazard. The first subordinate, still sitting on the coolant housing, said something to the second that the dock audio picked up, but which I am going to paraphrase, because the original transmission wall teleport, and because the precise wording is, I think, less important than its content. He said that the ship was wrong. There was something in there that didn't move like anything moved, and that he was not going back in for any consideration of money or honor. The second said nothing. The third, still facing away from the ship with his hand on the hatch release, said in a flat and very quiet voice that Orithvel was still in there. No one responded to that. T907, my security notification got its response. 2 dock security officers, Hethrin and Saval, arrived at the bay entrance. I briefed them through the intercom in approximately 40 words. They looked at the feed. They looked at each other. Hethrin asked me if the human was still aboard. I said yes, as far as I could tell from sensor data, and that she had been aboard since 071 and 7 and had, to the best of my knowledge, not exited at any point. Saval said something that I will also paraphrase. He said that they were going to stand at the bay entrance and wait, and that this seemed like the correct decision. I agreed. At 0911, the dock sensors registered movement on the forward section of the ship's internal corridor, specifically, a pressure door cycling. Interior pressure doors on the Valdrath-class hull have a distinct sensor signature when they operate. They have a hydraulic assist that produces a particular reading on the atmospheric sensor, pressure differential, as the door moves through its seal. I had seen this signature approximately 40 times since 0717 told me that Karis Vale had been moving through the ship steadily for nearly 2 hours, compartment by compartment, and had not been idle. Pressure door signature came again at 912, then again at 0914, moving forward through the hull toward the boarding ramp section. At 916, Karis Vale walked off the ship. She was carrying her toolkit bag on her shoulder, the same as when she had gone in. In her left hand, she had the compact survey scanner, which she was still operating. I could see the screen was lit, scrolling something. In her right hand, she held 2 items of physical cargo manifest binder, the kind used for sealed record survey cargoes, and a document folder that I recognized from the authority standard cover sheet visible on top as an impound salvage claim filing. She walked down the boarding ramp at the same pace she had used going up it. She passed the first Keth-Forath subordinate, who was still sitting on the coolant housing. He turned his head to track her. She did not look at him. She passed the second, who was against the wall. He pressed further into the wall. She did not look at him either. She passed the third, who still had his hand on the hatch release and still had not opened it. And at this point, she did glance at him. Not with anything you could call concern, more the way you might glance at a door sensor when you're walking up past to make sure it doesn't close on you. And then she came across the dock, floor toward the bay entrance where Hethrin and Soval were standing. She stopped in front of me. She looked at me through the visor, with an expression I can only describe as somewhere between routine completion and mild inconvenience. She said, "Where's your coffee dispenser?" I told her it was down the corridor to the left. She said, "Thank you." She put the cargo manifest binder and the salvage claim folder on my counter, patted them once with her free hand in a way that suggested I should hold on to them, and walked down the corridor to the left. I looked at Hethrin. Hethrin looked at me. We both looked at the document folder. The cover sheet had a timestamp on it. The claim had been filed, according to the timestamp, at 0819, an hour and 13 minutes before the Keth-Forath arrived. An hour and 13 minutes before anyone ordered her to clear anything. I opened the folder. The filing was complete. All sections filled. The required survey documentation attached, including a 47-page internal assessment of VD4471 Kal's condition that she had apparently completed during those first 99 minutes aboard the ship alone, in the cold and the dark, while the atmospheric mix was slightly off-standard, and the power plant was running on emergency conservation, and the internal temperature was 4 degrees. The assessment covered every major compartment, cataloged the cargo hold contents against the sealed manifest she was now handing in, noted the structural status of 6 key hull sections with a precision that would have required her to navigate the entire ship from bow to stern and then back again. She had filed the claim, she had completed the assessment, she had done all of it before the Keth-Forath ever stepped onto the dock. 7 pages. In 99 minutes, in a cold, dark ship that had been adrift for 14 months. I closed the folder. I looked at Hethrin again. Hethrin said, "Where's the fourth one?" And that was when we came back to the question of Orith Vel. Let me be clear about what the dock sensors recorded. Because this is an official document and I want it to be accurate. The sensors on Dock 9 Tertiary are standard authority grade. Atmospheric trace, pressure differential, heat signature, audio pickup in the approach corridor and the immediate exterior. They do not cover the ship's interior directly. There are no active sensors inside. Impounded vessels because impound vessels are, by definition, not authority property, and the authority to instrument the interior does not exist, under standard protocol. What the sensors could tell me was what happened at the interfaces. Between 0856, when the Keth-Forath boarded, and 0916, when Karis Vale walked off, the dock atmosphere registered 11 distinct pressure differential events consistent with interior pressure doors, cycling. These events, mapped against the timeline of the Keth-Forath exits, told a particular story. Crew had moved into the ship, and then fragmented, which is not what a 4-member team doing a coordinated board and claim typically does. 0919 Hethrin entered the ship to look for Orith Vel. Soval stayed at the bay entrance. At 0924, Hethrin came back out and reported that Orith Vel was in the crew berthing section. Compartment 3, on the second deck. He was alive and physically uninjured. He was sitting on a bunk with secondary limbs retracted, and his eyes fixed on a point in the middle. Distance that, as far as Hethrin could determine, had nothing in it. He was not speaking, he was breathing. He was, according to Hethrin, simply sitting there in the cold and dark of a ship that no longer had anyone else in it, and looking at nothing. Hethrin asked him if he could walk. He could walk. He walked off the ship and out of Dock 9 Tertiary, without speaking and without, to my knowledge, filing a formal report about anything. He and his 3 crew members left Port Orvith Kal on their own vessel, approximately 2 hours later. The lien document he had handed me was subsequently found, upon proper registry query, to reference a service company that had been dissolved and struck from the hegemony registry 11 months prior. The maintenance debt it described had never been registered with the authorities' lean tracking system. The document was, as I said, almost certainly fabricated. No complaint was filed by the Kethvorath crew against Karis Vale personally. No complaint was filed with the authority against the conduct of the boarding. The three subordinates did not speak to me, to security, any authority representative before leaving. Orath Vel, when Hethrin asked him what had happened inside the ship, said 3 words. "I have them in the audio log," he said. "She was waiting. Then he left. I want to spend some time on what I have been able to reconstruct, because I am an assessor and reconstruction is what I do." Karis Vale's 47-page assessment tells a partial story. Not a complete one. It is an assessment document, not a narrative. But if you read it carefully and cross-reference it against the technical brief she had filed with her authorization request, a picture emerges. The Valdreth-class survey hull is a 40-year-old design that was considered advanced when it was built and is now simply considered reliable. It has several features that are not widely known outside of the survey contracting community, because they are not features that come up often in standard operations. One of them is the Emergency Environmental Response System. The Valdreth class was designed for Class 18 and above survey environments, planets with hostile atmospheric conditions, unstable geology, biosphere hazards. Planets where a crew might need to seal compartments at speed, alter the atmospheric mix in specific sections of the ship, or use the ship itself as a controlled environment tool. The environmental response system is tied to the same power plant that was running on emergency conservation mode when VD-4471 Cal arrived. It is not fully functional in conservation mode, but some of its functions remain available. Specifically, compartment-level atmospheric control remains available. The ability to alter the oxygen to inert gas mix in individual compartments independently while leaving other compartments unaffected. Karis Vale's assessment document lists the environmental response system in the ship's operational status section. She marks it as partially functional, conservation mode, atmospheric override available at compartment level. She notes it as a salvage consideration. Recommend full restoration of environmental controls prior to cargo extraction, given Class 23 designation history and potential for residual biological hazard in forward hold. It is a technical note. It is 2 sentences. She does not elaborate. The Valdreth class technical manual, which I pulled from the registry library after reading her assessment, includes a section on the environmental response system that describes its emergency applications. One application is decontamination protocol, reducing oxygen concentration in a sealed compartment to a level that will neutralize biological contaminants while leaving the rest of the ship breathable. The protocol is designed for situations where a hazardous organism or substance has been introduced into a compartment and needs to be cleared without exposing the rest of the crew. The manual specifies that the protocol can be activated from the environmental console on the engineering deck. It specifies the override sequence. It specifies the compartment selection interface. Karis Vale's assessment includes, in the engineering section, a notation. Environmental console operational, override sequence confirmed functional. I want to be clear that I am drawing inferences here. I did not watch what happened inside the ship. I have the sensor data, the assessment document, the technical manual, and a 40-page report written by a human recovery specialist who spent 99 minutes alone on a cold derelict before 4 Kethvorath came aboard and then had their professional cohesion dismantled in under 15 minutes. Inferring that Karis Vale, during those her first 99 minutes, did several things simultaneously. She assessed the ship. She documented the cargo. She filed the salvage claim. And she learned the ship. Not in the way you learn a ship when you have read the manual and understand it intellectually. In the way you learn a ship when you have moved through every corridor, in the cold and the dark. You have put your hands on the actual mechanisms. When you have tested the things the manual says work, and noted what condition they are actually in. The 2-page technical brief she had filed with her authorization request was not pulled from a library. She had operated Valdreth-class hulls before. She knew what the environmental response system was capable of. She knew, before the Kethvorath arrived, what tools the ship contained. What I believe happened. And I want to be very precise here. I am an assessor and I deal in documented fact. But I also have 19 years of processing incident reports. And I know how situations develop is. This, Orith Vel brought his crew aboard expecting to find one human woman in a cold, dark ship and an easy conversation about jurisdiction. What he found instead was a ship that already had an occupant who knew where everything was, knew how everything worked, and had, in the time since she arrived, made herself more a part of the ship's operational systems than the ship's original crew had probably been on a good day. I want to try to describe what that would mean practically for 4 Keth-Vorith boarding an unfamiliar vessel in low-light conditions. Keth-Vorith are adapted for outdoor environments. Wide-spectrum vision in direct light, strong spatial orientation in open terrain, very good at reading threats at distance. They are not, by design or evolutionary history, suited to enclosed spaces. They board ships. They fight in transit corridors when they have to. But their primary tactical advantage is scale and direct confrontation, and a derelict survey hull in impound dock conditions takes that advantage and compresses it. Corridors of a Valdrath-class hull are 2 meters wide. The ceiling clearance is 2.3. Keth-Vorith in full equipment are not comfortable in a Valdrath-class corridor, and comfort is the first thing that goes when a species is already outside its preferred environment. The second thing that goes is light. VD-4471 Kal in conservation mode had functional emergency lighting in the main corridors. Amber strips along the floor and wall junctions, running at about 30% of normal output. Enough to navigate by. Not enough to get the visual range that Keth-Vorith depend on. Wide-spectrum vision requires more light than emergency strips provide to function at full acuity. In 30% emergency amber, Keth-Vorith is navigating at significantly reduced visual capacity. And they know it, and that knowledge sits in the background of every decision they make. Karis Vale had been on that ship for 99 minutes. In that same amber emergency lighting, in that same cold, moving through every compartment, putting her hands on every mechanism, she had not needed the full acuity. She had not been mapping threats at distance. She had been learning the ship close, in the dark, the way you learn a space when the space itself is the thing you need to understand. When the Keth-Vorith came aboard, she knew where the doors were. She knew which ones the emergency hydraulics would open quickly, and which ones had a half-second lag. She knew which compartments were colder, and which retained more heat from the residual plant output. She knew, because she had tested it and noted it in the assessment, which sections of corridor produced an audio reflection that would carry sound further than expected. She knew what the atmospheric console could do, and she had already confirmed it was functional. The Keth-Vorith fragmented, in a confined space, in low light, with atmospheric conditions shifting unpredictably by compartment, against something that moved through the ship without hesitation and without noise. Because she knew exactly where she was going. The 4-member became 3 separate problems for themselves. The first subordinate came out fast. The second came out faster. The third came to the hatch, and couldn't make himself leave, because leaving meant admitting something, and stayed instead with his hand on the release. Orith Vel sat in the dark in compartment 3 and waited to be found. None of them were physically harmed. I want to note that. The medical log shows no injury reports from any of the 4 Keth-Vorith. Hethrin, when he found Orith Vel, reported no evidence of physical confrontation in the compartment. No damage to the fittings, no scorch marks, nothing that indicated a fight had happened in that space. What I think happened in the compartments, what I think the atmospheric variation at the ramp base was indicating, what the indeterminate tone on the audio log corresponds to, is that Karis Vale used the ship as the instrument. She did not confront the Keth-Vorith. She managed the ship's environment, compartment by compartment, and let the Keth-Vorith manage themselves. A slight reduction in oxygen in one corridor, not dangerous but enough to make the air feel thin, enough to register in the body before the mind catches up, and provides a rational explanation. Door cycling. At an unexpected moment in the dark, with the half-second hydraulic lag she had noted, when someone is already uncertain about where the threat is. Sound carrying further in a reflective corridor than a being's instincts expect. coming from a direction that the emergency amber lighting does not resolve into a clear source. None of it was violent. All of it was the ship. She had 99 minutes, and a technical brief, and a Class 23 environmental clearance. And she made those 99 minutes count in a way that I do not think the Kethvarath understood, and possibly never will. What happened in that compartment, I do not know. What Orithvel saw, or thought he saw, or heard, felt in terms of the air changing around him in a ship he did not know in a dark that he was not adapted to. I do not know. He said she was waiting. He may have meant that he found her there before he found his way out. He may have meant something else. He left without filing a report, which tells me something. Karis Vale came back to my counter at Zone 941, carrying a standard-size insulated cup from the vending corridor dispenser. She had taken her helmet off. She was younger than I had expected from her credentials. Mid-30s by human reckoning, which is nothing to a species that can live past a century of active service if their circumstances allow. She had a small scar on the left side of her jaw, the kind that does not come from surgery. Her hair was flat from the helmet liner, which is a detail I include simply because it is the detail that made her look most like a person standing in an impound dock after 2 hours in a cold, dark ship rather than a concept. She looked at the folder on my counter. She looked at the cargo manifest binder. She looked at me. She said, "Has the lien been reviewed?" I told her the lien had been flagged for formal review and that the service company cited in the documentation appeared to be dissolved. I told her that the review process under the Impound Act would require a minimum 48-hour processing period, but that given the apparent deficiencies in the filing, I expected the outcome. She nodded. She drank from the cup. She said, "The forward hold has 4 sealed survey crates under the original contract manifest. They're listed in the assessment. Beam. The consortium lost the chain of custody when they declared the ship abandoned, which means, under the Recovery Act, the cargo converts to salvage along with the hull. I've listed them in the claim." I told her I had seen them listed. She said, "The environmental systems need a full restoration before anyone moves those crates." I noted it in the assessment. The Class 23 survey designation means there's a non-trivial probability of biological trace material in the hold. Standard hazard protocol applies. I told her I would note that recommendation in the intake record. She drank from the cup again. She looked at the boarding ramp for a moment in the same way she had looked at the ship before she first boarded it, reading it. Then she looked back at me and said, "The 4th one, Orithvel. He's okay." I told her he had been found, physically unharmed, and had left the dock under his own power. She nodded once. She said, "Good." Not with any particular relief. Not with satisfaction. The way you say good when a variable you had accounted for has resolved the way you expected, and you can close that line in the mental tally. I processed her salvage claim over the following 36 hours as the lien dispute resolved. The filing was formally voided on a standard registry query as I had expected, and VD 4471 call was transferred from impound status to recovery claim status under her credentials. She spent those 36 hours aboard the ship. Not continuously. She had a berth in the transit accommodation block, and docs the access logs show her leaving and returning twice during the processing period. But for the majority of those 36 hours she was aboard, completing what the assessment had started. Restore systems cataloging the cargo in detail, bringing the environmental response system back to full operational status, took her approximately 14 hours and involved several components she sourced from the Port Orvith Call maintenance parts warehouse on an account she had apparently maintained at this port for some time. She had been here before. I found that in the access logs afterward. She had transited through Port Orvith Call 7 times in the previous 4 years, always solo, always inbound or outbound for expanside survey work. I had processed 2 of her prior authorization requests myself, and had no memory of them, because there had been nothing to remember. A contracted recovery specialist, paperwork clean, no incidents. On the 3rd day, when the salvage claim had cleared and VD 4471 call was formally hers, Karis Vale disconnected the hull from the mag clamps, ran a systems check that I could observe on the dock sensor feeds. All systems cycling cleanly now. Power plant at full operational output for the first time in 14 months. Life support green across all compartments. Atmospheric mix standard. And asked me over the .com what the current fuel cost was at the Port Orvithcal dispensary. I told her. She said that was reasonable and filed a fuel requisition. While the ship was being fueled, she came back to my counter one last time. She returned the transit accommodation key. She filed her departure notification. She gave me a forwarding contact for any follow-up correspondence on the salvage claim. I asked her, because I had been turning the question over for 2 days and had decided I was allowed one, what the ship's original crew had used it for. The survey consortium's manifest was sealed, and my authorization only covered the salvage intake documentation, not the classified cargo contents. She looked at me for a moment. She said, Class 23 survey, you know what that means. I said I did. Class 23 is an extreme environment designation, arid hostile. Temperature variance in excess of 90 degrees Celsius between surface and atmospheric layer. Trace biological hazard. The kind of planet that gets a high classification, not because it is dramatically dangerous in an obvious way, but because it operates on you slowly, in ways you do not notice until you notice them all at once, she said. The crew was good. They were careful. They followed protocols. She paused. The Class 23 environment does something to certain species over long exposure. Nothing biological. It's more perceptual. You start to feel like you should stay. Like leaving would be wrong somehow. The planet doesn't want you to go, and after enough time you start to agree with it. I thought about the crew of VD 4471 call, 7 beings, 14 months of silence. I asked her if that was what happened to them. She picked up her transit key and turned it over in her fingers for a moment. She said, the survey crates in the hold are soil samples and atmospheric trace collections from the surface. Sealed. Double sealed. Actually, I added a second containment layer when I was down in the hold before anyone else came aboard. She looked at me. In the assessment too. I found it later, on page 31. One sentence, forward hold cargo, 4 survey crates, Class 23 surface collection, double sealed per hazard protocol. Transfer to authority quarantine storage. Recommended prior to any chain of custody. Transfer to consortium. One sentence. On page 31 of 47, she said goodbye and walked back to her ship. The departure sensors logged VD 4471 call, clearing the outer bay doors at 1407 on the 3rd day. The beacon showed her heading inward, toward the main shipping lanes, at standard cruise. Clean flight path. Nothing interesting. I filed the incident report that afternoon. All relevant documentation attached. Keth Voreth lien voided. Salvage claim approved. No injuries. No property damage to authority assets. No violations of impound protocol. I sat at my terminal for a while after I filed it. The incident report runs to 11 pages, which is long for a Port Orvithcal intake dispute. Most run 2 to 4. The additional pages are the sections where I attempt to document what the sensors captured and what the sensor data implies, and where I note the authorities' record, the technical details about the Valdrath class environmental response system that seem relevant to a complete account. I tried to be accurate without speculating beyond what the evidence supports. I think I mostly succeeded. Section I rewrote the most was the one about the atmospheric trace variation at the base of the boarding ramp, because I wanted to be clear that I was noting it as a data point and not as a conclusion. And I kept drifting into conclusion. Final version of that section reads, trace atmospheric variation detected at dock bay level, near boarding ramp between approximately 0858 and 091. 4. Vachian within normal operational range for the facility noted for completeness. It is accurate. It is precise. It does not say what I think it means, because what I think it means is not something I can prove from dock sensor data, and the authorities' incident reports are not the place for what I think. This document, however, is a supplementary personal account submitted alongside the formal report, and in a supplementary personal account, I am, apparently, allowed to say what I think. I think Karis Voale walked into a cold, dark ship with a 14-month-old history of a lost crew, a Class 23 survey designation, and 4 sealed crates in the forward hold. And she treated it as a professional problem with a clean solution. She assessed the situation. She identified the tools available. She used them efficiently and without drama, and when the drama arrived in the form of 4 large Keth-Vorath with a fabricated lean, she had already arranged the situation such that she did not need to escalate. She had already won before they arrived. She had won at 0819 when she filed the claim. She had won before that, during the 99 minutes when she was the only living being on the ship, and she used that time to become fluent in it. The drama, the exits, Orith Vel sitting in the dark, the indeterminate tone on the audio log, was incidental. Consequences of the Keth-Vorath's decision to board a ship that was by that point no longer unoccupied in any meaningful sense. They had walked into a space that had an owner, and the owner knew it better than they did, and they found that out in ways that the dock sensors could only partially capture. I thought about the Keth-Vorath, about Orith Vel specifically, sitting in the dark in compartment 3, with his secondary limbs retracted, saying she was waiting. I thought about what it means to go into a cold, dark ship that you do not know, expecting to find someone you can bully, and instead find someone who has spent 99 minutes making the ship's systems their own. Someone who knows where every door is. Someone who knows what the air in each compartment is, and can change it. Someone who has already, an hour and 13 minutes before you arrived, written down exactly what the ship is worth, and what she intends to do with it. I thought about the double-sealed crates in the forward hold, and about Class 23 planet that makes certain species feel like they should stay. And I thought about the human woman who had gone down to that hold first, before any of that mattered, and sealed the crates a second time, before she had any reason to believe anyone was coming. Not because someone told her to. Because she read the ship's history, and she did the math. The security notification I sent at 053 was formally closed out at 1603 on the 3rd day. Status: resolved. No further action required. I closed it myself. I went home at the end of my shift. I made dinner. I read through the Valdrath class technical manual that evening. The full document. All 312 pages. I process 11,000 impound arrivals, and I had never felt, until that week, that there were things inside the ships I was processing that I did not understand well enough. I finished it around midnight. I filed it in my personal reference library. Then I sat for a while in my kitchen, which is quiet and well-lit and very far from the Vethran expanse, and I thought about the other 23 ships currently sitting in impound at Port Orvithkal, and what was inside them, and I thought about a human recovery specialist, somewhere in the shipping lanes by now, piloting a reclaimed Valdrath class, hull-backed civilization with 4 double-sealed crates in the forward hold and a 47-page HAID assessment document that answered every question except the one I had actually wanted to ask. I had wanted to ask, were you afraid? Of the Keth-Vorath, of the ship, of the dark and the cold, and the slightly off-standard atmosphere, and the Class 23, planet's history sitting in sealed crates 8 meters from where she was working. Of whatever the original crew had felt, in the end, when they decided that leaving was the wrong thing to do. I had not asked because it was not an assessor's question, because I was fairly certain I already knew the answer. Not afraid. Not unbothered either. She was not careless. And careless is what unbothered looks like when the danger is real. She had added the second containment layer before anyone else came aboard. She had filed the claim before anyone could threaten her claim. She had noted the environmental protocol and the hazard recommendation before anyone asked. She had done it all in 99 minutes, in the cold, and then she had asked me where the coffee was. The Valdrath class technical manual has, as a section I had not known about before that week, in an appendix near the back. It covers the design history of the Class 18 and above environmental rating, and it includes a note about the survey environments the ship was built to operate in. It says, and I am quoting from the official registry edition, Autoracers should be aware that Class 18 and above survey environments present cumulative perceptual adaptation risks to species not evolutionarily conditioned for extreme environmental pressure. Extended surface operations are recommended only for personnel with verified high-grade environmental tolerance certification. The section does not say which species have verified high-grade environmental tolerance certification. It does not need to say. There is only one species in the hegemony registry that holds a Class 23 environmental clearance as a standard issue credential. The same species that evolved on a planet that the hegemony registry has classified, depending on the edition you consult, as somewhere between Class 14 and Class 17. A place that makes other species feel like they should leave as quickly as possible and not come back. I think about that sometimes when a new derelict comes through the outer bay doors on a recovery beacon. I think about what the ship has been through and what it might be carrying, and whether the person who goes aboard to find out is the right kind of person for the job. I think about a 47-page assessment document and a timestamped that read Arrow 819, and 4 Kethvorith who left without filing a report, and a Class 23 planet that makes you want to stay. And I think, it matters who you send into the dark. It matters very much.